Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another episode of What's Up Doc. I'm your host, Dr. Aalia Al-Barwani, and I'm a board-certified physician. My show, What's Up Doc, is a production of Muslim Network TV, the only Muslim-focused network broadcasting in North America. You can find us on our website at muslimnetwork.tv and on our YouTube page at youtube.com/Muslim Network TV. You can also find our shows streaming on Roku TV, Apple TV, Fire TV, and Galaxy 19. So today we're going to be talking about ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, a condition that affects millions of children and adults around the world, including here in the US. Joining us in that discussion is Dr. Sohail Nibras. Dr. Nibras is a double board certified physician in both child, adolescent, and adult psychiatry. He completed his Doctor of Medicine at the American University of Integrative Science. Dr. Nibras then went on to complete his psychiatry residency training at the St. Louis University School of Medicine, and subsequently his child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship at the Southern Illinois University School of Medicine in 2020. Dr. Nibras currently serves as an assistant professor with the Baylor College of Medicine. He also has a small private practice where he treats individuals of various ages and psychiatric conditions, including but not limited to anxiety, ADHD, depression, mood, and thought disorders. Dr. Nibras offers both talk therapy and traditional therapeutics, including medications. Welcome, Dr. Nibras. It's a pleasure to have you here today with us. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing very well. How are you? Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. I'm doing well. Thank you. So as I mentioned in the introduction, millions of people across the world and including the United States are affected by ADHD. And honestly, as I talk to patients and even people in my personal life, so many people think that they have this diagnosis. I think that people who have trouble with just focusing in general tend to think that they're somehow on that spectrum of ADHD and are eager for a diagnosis. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what makes the diagnosis. Let's start with that and defining what ADHD is for our audience.
Sure, absolutely. And so ADHD is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's a condition that causes trouble in people's daily functioning in regards to their paying attention, as well as hyperactivity and impulsive behaviors. So these are three components. So some people may have all of those, some people may have some of them, and this actually affects their daily living and in different areas of their functioning. So for example, in children, this may be affecting their school performance as well as their life at home. So to diagnose somebody with ADHD, we need to have two different settings according to our DSM, which is a diagnostic statistic manual for our psychiatry field. So we need to have a particular, many people will tell us that I'm having trouble focusing, or I'm having a hard time paying attention at work or at school. But to diagnose this condition properly, we need the symptoms of inattention or hyperactivity/impulsivity in two different settings that is clinically affecting their daily functioning in the areas.
Excellent. So I've actually had to give out that, as you mentioned, that it's a specific diagnosis, and it's diagnosed in two different settings. So for school-aged children, we're talking about in school and in the home. And there are actually forms that you can get from your doctor's office. And actually, you can probably print out online to fill out as a parent for your child and to take to the school to complete. And after review of those forms, the diagnosis can be made because they ask for symptoms that are associated with ADHD, correct? So let's talk about what are, and we're starting by talking about in children. Absolutely, we will. I would like to definitely talk about it in adults as well, because it can be a little bit different how it presents. We don't often find children, adults running around all over the place and an inability to sit still in a classroom. So it definitely is it looks different in adults. But back to children here, let's talk about what are those signs and symptoms? What are some of those questions on those forms looking for as far as signs and symptoms?
Yeah, so some of those symptoms, like, for example, the free scale that parents or any physician or anybody on Google can find is called Vanderbilt scale for ADHD.
Okay.
That is a form for teachers as well as parents, different sections that are completed in 2 different settings. And most of the time, the questions that are being asked are excessive fidgetiness or difficulties remaining seated on this in the class, feeling restless, and difficulty paying attention or sitting quietly, difficulty keeping up. They're just on the go, just all the time. They may have difficulty, with their talking. They may talk so excessively in the class when the teacher is talking, may have difficulty waiting for their turns. They blurt out answer too quickly before even teacher stops asking. They interrupt other people. They are intrusive to other people. Mm-hmm. Those are the symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity. But there is another domain which is inattention. That is, failure to pay close attention to details. They make careless mistake. They have difficulty maintaining attention in activities for homework or school or other play activities. They seem to not listen when they are directly addressed. Then they are also fail to follow homework or do chores at home. They have difficulty organizing tasks and activities. They avoid tasks that require consistent mental effort. So many a time, for example, parents come to us that my child can play video games or watch movies for hours on end. Or when it comes to the homework or when it comes to doing activity that requires attention, they are not able to do that. And they are easily distracted. They are very forgetful. They lose their book bags and pencils and other things. And they come home, mommy or daddy, I lost something. So parents have to buy multiple things for them. So those are the symptoms that we are looking at: inattention, hyperactivity, and sometimes the impulsivity, where they are getting into arguments and fights at school. Detentions and suspensions are happening. Parents are being called on consistent basis to pick up their kids or help the teachers try to discipline them in the classroom as well as home settings.
Okay, excellent. Very thorough. Thank you, Dr. Nibras. So what I'm hearing is a wide range of symptoms that are varied. And it sounds like the common theme here is all of these behaviors are disruptive. And I think that that's a big key when it comes to diagnosing and treatment, because we want to identify behavior that is particularly disruptive. And the reason I'm focusing on that is because I've had children who are younger than school age who present with similar symptoms to what you're describing. And parents want to start their children on medication. And my advice to them is that they are not yet in school. Their behavior is not disruptive or affecting their ability to get a proper education. And I discourage treatment that young, to be honest with you. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as far as treatment in children younger than school age. So we're talking about younger than age 5. And
Sure.
then along that, what is the youngest age that you treat? Is for ADHD.
Sure. So this varies in different settings. Like you mentioned, treating if somebody is not in school or not having those activities where they need to pay attention or be in class and sit and listen to the teacher or follow the directions. Depending on the age, particularly 4 to 6 years of age, that's sort of the range for preschoolers. That is the range when we tend to use the behavioral therapy, where sending the child to the therapist, learning some ways to cope with their ADHD, as well as having the parents understand their diagnosis and see if how parents can help manage some of his hyperactivity, if that is causing some difficulties at home, or is it inattentiveness. Now, speaking of that, the behavioral therapy is actually recommended for preschool age 4 to 6. But when it is becoming very difficult for the parents to actually manage them home, where they're getting very impulsive and they're throwing things and the tantrums are really huge, that parents are not able to manage, and they are very hyperactive, that they are throwing the whole house upside down, and the behavioral therapy is not really helpful, then we do consider medications such as Ritalin or Adderall, very commonly known in public. So those medication on a very small dose, I tend to use some Ritalin and have used for kids as young as 3 years old, when they have other diagnoses such as anxiety or autism, particularly. So in those cases, we do use medications, but those kids who doesn't have diagnosis of autism or other comorbidities, other pre-existing diagnosis with ADHD, then we try to do the therapy. And if the parents are having truly really hard time, or if the child is in daycare, for example, then this will be time to consider some medication on a very low dose. I also try to use non-stimulant medication because these kids are still growing. Number one recommended is Ritalin or Adderall, but in my practice, I try to use non-stimulant medication, which are like some of the blood pressure medication, clonidine or guanfacine. They can be very helpful, kind of bringing them their hyperactivity and impulsivity and helping them regulate some of their emotions. And as well as many kids are having difficulty sleeping at night. So these are very helpful with sleep as well.
Very interesting. And we'll get into treatment a little bit more later. But I love how you broke that down for us, essentially in describing that, again, it's disruptive behavior, whether that's in the home or at school. And so there comes a time when medications may be needed after therapy has been tried and failed, or not as effective. Now, in your practice, Dr. Nibras, what are some common misconceptions about ADHD? What do you typically have people come into your office believing about ADHD that may be false?
Many a time parents come and say that my child, if there's a teenager or if it is a preschooler around age 8, 9, 10, they say that my child is disobedient, he does not listen to us, he is disrespectful, depending on the culture and where the family background is from. So many people will have misconceptions that they are very disrespectful, they don't listen to us, they don't follow us. And parents may sometimes have arguments that this comes from your family, or that her family, or his family. That also becomes a very difficult, for particularly some of the cultures where ADHD is not very well known. And then also, it's very difficult for the parents to take the side that this truly may be an ADHD. Many parents, when they come to us, they have done lots of Google research and they know a lot about what their hyperactivity is and why the kid is acting the way they are acting. They may have read it, but they are still in denial that this may be their child. And many a times, research shows us that there is a strong genetic and family history, and parents themselves may have it, their family members may have it, So sometimes it's very hard for parents to actually grasp that idea that my child could have an ADHD, and it is very difficult for them to accept.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. And specifically when you talk about family history and genetic components. So something to be aware of for our audience to be aware of. You're watching What's Up Doc on Muslim Network TV, and we'll be back after this short break.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Right here, baby. Look. Uma.
¿Cuántos años tienes?
Noah.
Something more than a birthday is happening here. Once you can see it, you can help. The sooner you recognize the signs of autism, the sooner you can make a lifetime of difference for your child. Start by answering a few simple questions at screenforautism.org.
Welcome back. My name is Dr. Aalia Al-Barwani, and you're watching What's Up Doc on Muslim Network TV. Joining us today is Dr. Sohail Nibras. He's a psychiatrist, and we've been talking today about ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Quite a mouthful, so we're going to stick with ADHD. All right, Dr. Nibras. So before the break, we were going over the diagnosis, and you touched on treatment a little bit. We'll get into that in this next half. But I wanted to touch on the difference between ADHD and ADD before we move forward, because ADD is still a term that I hear a lot. And I think it's important for our audience to understand what is the difference, or how ADD can be a part of ADHD.
Yes. So ADD is a slightly older term from, as I mentioned, according to DSM-4, which we used to use back in 2013. It was a part of a separate sort of entity. So it used to be ADHD and ADD. But then since 2013, it became one diagnosis, which is ADHD. And there are now types of ADHD, which is, like I alluded to, ADHD hyperactive type and ADHD inattentive type. So ADHD inattentive type is actually the same thing as ADD, which does not have a hyperactivity in it. Now, there is also ADHD combined type, where the people may have hyperactivity, impulsivity, as well as inattention and distractibility. So that is the big difference. The terms changed, but they still describe the similar symptomatology. So as I listed those symptoms earlier, so we need 5 of symptoms from each list. For example, if the symptoms of inattention, we need 5 of them to diagnose somebody with ADHD inattentive type, which is equivalent to ADD. And then if somebody's hyperactive or impulsive, we need 5 of those symptoms that I listed earlier out of 9 symptoms to diagnose somebody with ADHD hyperactive type. But if somebody has both hyperactivity as well as inattention and distractibility, then we need a 5 from each category to make them ADHD combined type, which means they have inattentiveness, distractibility, as well as impulsivity or hyperactivity.
Excellent. So to summarize, ADD is an older term that we don't really use anymore, and that stands for attention deficit disorder. It's lacking that hyperactivity and impulsivity
Yes.
Aspect there. However, now it's all under this umbrella term ADHD. And under that, there are different subtypes that describe the different features that a person may have more of. Okay, great. So now that we've kind of run through what that diagnosis looks like in children, let's talk about ADHD in adults, because this is something that, I mean, you may disagree, but I find is underdiagnosed. A lot of people come to me with symptoms, and when I start probing, they've had these symptoms through their development that was undiagnosed, and now they're presenting as an adult. So let's talk about that. And for adults, what does ADHD look like?
So that goes back to stigma in psychiatry. And like we mentioned earlier, sometimes it is very difficult for the parents to accept that my child may have a diagnosis of ADHD. So many a time I see adults who have had symptoms of ADHD throughout their childhood. But either parents did not want to get help, either they were diagnosed and the parents didn't feel comfortable with the medications, which we will discuss, I guess, in a few minutes, some of the side effects they were afraid of. And then the child goes through the system without getting any help. Other times, they may have inattentive, like ADD or ADHD, inattentive type, which means they're sitting there and they are daydreaming, but they're not causing any trouble in the class. They're not having any difficulties where they're being looked at or picked at. So they go through the system. They may be passing their classes. Now, ADHD is, just to clarify, is not a symptom of people who have low intellectual functioning. It's a symptom of all ranges. There are people who are doctors and engineers. They may have ADHD. There are people who on a lower spectrum of intellectual capacity. They may have ADHD. So it's a spectrum. And just to say that if somebody was sitting and daydreaming, they may have not been diagnosed in their childhood, but also the parents may have helped them with their homework, or provided a lot of supports in elementary school or middle school. And now it comes to the high school when they're having more difficulty, when they have to keep up with a different schedule. Now, all of a sudden, schedules is different. They may have to go from one class to another class, and they may not be able to keep up with that. Or when they go to the college, when they have to take charge of their own life to keep up with and track everything in their schedule and make sure that they get up on time. They may be away from home at college and out of town type of situation. So they may have a hard time keeping up with everything at college work. So that's where they may figure out, hey, why am I having all this trouble? So that's where, they got misdiagnosed. The family didn't want to diagnose them or treat them, or they were inattentive. And many a times, boys are a little bit more hyperactive, which means they will be caught, so that they will get more attention. And the girls, on the other hand, may have more inattentive type of ADHD, and they may not have any trouble until they get to the college. So those symptoms those presentations also affect where the ADHD is getting some attention now.
Very interesting. I love how you broke that down for us, because just like you said, there may be systems that are set up to help support individuals when they are at a younger age and developing that are no longer there when they go to college, or they now have to function independently. So I love that point. Let's talk about some co-diagnoses that are often found in patients who suffer with ADHD. You touched a little bit on it earlier in children who may have autism or anxiety. What are some other co-diagnoses that you find in patients who have ADHD?
Yeah, so when I am seeing patients, I am pleading parents, and I'm providing the best information I can provide them to help them understand the diagnosis. Dr. Russell Barkley, who is a psychologist and has done an extensive research on ADHD, and in his books, he explains how ADHD is an executive function disorder. So ADHD is the front of the brain, this area right here. This is an area where your executive function is managed by. So this is one of the area where development is kind of slow in ADHD kids in terms of age. So for example, we know boys may develop a couple years later cognitively and decision-making wise compared to some of their same age peer females. So it is because the frontal lobe is not fully developed and is catching up with. So ADHD is an executive frontal lobe disorder, and it needs attention. So when ADHD is not treated properly, many a time young kids may have tantrums, they may have irritability, they may be aggressive, they are expressing themselves in an anger and irritability because they are so depressed and down inside. As far as the reason is that they are being picked on by teachers. Teachers tell them all day long, Johnny, sit down, Johnny, pay attention, Johnny, stop talking. And then all of a sudden, all the classmates in the class are looking at them, staring at them as to why Johnny is not able to pay attention. Why is Johnny a trouble? They may be picked on. They may be made fun of. This is also not good for their self-esteem. At home, when they come home, they had a whole terrible day at school where teacher was picking on them. The other colleagues and peers were picking on them at school. When they come home, the parents are saying, Johnny, pick up the trash. Johnny, throw this. Johnny, do this. So they are not able to get break from people asking them multiple times a day at different settings. So inside they are having sadness, depression, and in younger kids and teenagers, the depression doesn't show up as it would show up in adults. It shows up as more anger and frustration and aggressive behaviors because they don't understand why everybody is judging them and looking at them and making them stand out in a negative way. Also, anxiety shows up. It builds up inside. So then many of time, parents are showing up because their kid is having trouble with the anger issues, anxiety, and depression. And they could also be suicidal. Just had a 7-year-old in a hospital a couple of days ago saying that he's a suicidal and he wants to kill himself. And he stood up in a class and said, "You guys kill me." It's just because he's frustrated, everybody talking about it. So I always urge parents to make sure that we treat it with therapy. If that is not successful, the medications are the best option for ADHD. And I try to provide lots of information, education to help parents understand the consequences of this diagnosis, being treated versus not treated. And in older adults, when the teenagers grow up, they have untreated ADHD. To address their stress and internalized behaviors they have over the last few years, they may turn to substance abuse. They may go smoke cigarettes, take marijuana to calm their feelings and emotions. They may go into behaviors that may not be very good for them and their future. So it leads to a lot of difficulty. And if the older adults are not treated, they may have marital problems. They may not have organization skills. They may not know how to function in different areas of their life.
Wow, that was really helpful, Dr. Nibras, and such a heartbreaking story about the child that was suicidal. And I hope that he or she does better. And so the importance of treatment is definitely understood by what you've shared with us. As far as treatment for these co-symptoms or co-diagnoses of anxiety, depression, would just the treatment of ADHD resolve these symptoms, or do most of these patients who suffer from ADHD also need treatment separate for depression, anxiety, because as we know, those medications can differ from the treatment of ADHD. So are those two different treatments, or is just addressing the ADHD enough to resolve these other symptoms that you just mentioned?
So it varies with the child, depending on at what stage of the child are we meeting with them, are we diagnosing with them. If it's a child early on coming in and there has not been too much internalized damage from some of their ADHD behaviors, and then starting medications for ADHD can just be helpful. Now, if it is a teenager who has struggled quite a lot over the last 10, 12 years of their life, and they are having very hard time managing and coping all the stress from being judged and looked and put down by their loved one as well as friends and teachers, then they may need medications such as antidepressant or anti-anxiety medications, particularly if they are having symptoms and thoughts of ending their life that has become very serious. And at that point, they may also need psychiatric hospitalization to stabilize them and give them more intense therapy. But I have had a 16-year-old recently who had seen quite a few psychiatrists, and they were put on multiple different medications up until I saw them and I said, this is ADHD. We started him on medications, and his family after a month said this was a day and night. His anxiety and panic attacks and avoiding school has changed. He is able to focus. And so some of his anxiety and panic attack for which he was avoiding the school resolved because he was able to focus, and he was not able to keep up with his schoolwork and pay attention in class, because previously he was sitting daydreaming and had no idea what the teacher was teaching because his mind was all over the place. And now that he's on medication to pay attention, he has a little bit more confident that he is learning and he's listening and he's paying attention, and people are not judging him, and he's not having a panic attack and anxiety attacks that he was having. And on the other hand, I have had some kids who are even younger, and they are having lots of bullying and really anxiety from untreated ADHD. So in those cases, I do tend to use some antidepressant to help their anxiety along with the medications for ADHD.
Excellent. And I know you focused on children. I imagine that it would be the same when it comes to adults, as far as what you just described. Okay. Now we are running out of time. This has been a really riveting conversation, and I hope you as the audience, you've enjoyed this conversation as well. And so I'd like to just quickly touch on treatment, not specifically the different medication options, because that is, as you said, very individualized and dependent on the symptoms that the patient has, as well as other co-diagnoses, as you very clearly laid out for us in our discussion today. However, I just want you to please reassure our audience the safety and the importance of treatment, as you mentioned, how this can in childhood and then as a person grows and becomes an adult, these are problems that don't always resolve. And so they can become issues that affect their education and then their relationships, including their with loved ones. And so I would like to just talk about in general, the different options that are available. And then briefly about supplementation. There are some studies that I read many years now about the benefits of, for example, high-dose vitamin D and things like that. So I would love if we could just wrap up with some treatment, an overview of treatment, as well as possible supplementation in the treatment of ADHD.
Sure. So this is one of the diagnoses in psychiatry where medications are far better than therapy, but together they are still better. So like I mentioned earlier, from preschool age 4 to 6, we tend to go with therapy first and then medication if needed. But anybody who is school age and above, we go with the medication first. The research over the last many years have shown us that medications are far better for treating ADHD. But we also take the therapy approach to show them organization skills, how to manage their day, have routines and rhythm in their day, and have all those things, targets and goals that they need to work on. But medications are very safe. They do have, like any medication that we prescribe in any areas of medical field, they do have side effects. And some of the common side effects are, appetite suppression. Sometimes kids may not feel hungry. So I tend to tell them, you have a really good breakfast, take some snacks and granola bars and protein bars or fruits in the daytime, even if you're not feeling hungry, and then have dinner, a very good dinner. By the time you reach home, you are pretty hungry. The medications are out of your system. And then sometime we also manage and monitor for any heart condition, particularly if there is somebody with a family history of young adults having heart conditions. And then also we want to make sure that medication is adjusted according to the age, the dose, smaller dose for smaller kids. And even if those kids were older and they are not used to medication, we tend to start small dose and go up slowly, making sure that they are tolerating okay. The common medications, like I alluded earlier, are Ritalin or Adderall. They have a various different formulation of them. Some of them are short-acting, some of them are long-acting. For that, I mean, for example, you take a Ritalin in the morning, it lasts about 4 hours in your system. Then you take another one at school from your school nurse or at work if you are a working adult. And then by the time you reach home, that medication is actually out of your system. It helps you focus at school, take care of your schoolwork, and do well academically. And when you come home, it may not be in system. So sometimes if the kids are having a hard time keeping up with, homework or other chores at school, then we may do a small dose in the evening as well. That will also be out of your system by 8 p.m.
Yes.
And that helps you sleep at night as well. Many kids who are treated, they can help in the daytime. They help sleep better as well at night. And so those are some of the common medication. There are other ones. Those are
definitely, exactly. And to be honest with, and to be fair, though I definitely don't want us to go into those details in this episode today, just because in the interest of time, and also because every person is going to be different, and there are so many medications to get into them. We would definitely need another episode.
Yes.
So let's wrap up here. As far as the treatment, it sounds like it's definitely important to address that early on, to go speak with your doctor so that you can be diagnosed, get that diagnosis if that is in fact what you have, and then get treatment early to prevent some of these down the line complications and comorbidities that can occur with, or co-diagnoses that can occur with ADHD. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Nibras. This has been a pleasure talking to you, a very riveting subject that I personally am very interested in, and I hope that we provided a lot of useful information for our audience. There may be room for a second part, it seems, because we still have so much to talk about. So inshallah, we hope to have you again in future episodes, and we wish you every success in your career.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of What's Up, Doc. I'm your host, Dr. Aalia Al-Barwani. You can watch all of our other episodes on our website at muslimnetwork.tv. I'll see you next time on another episode of What's Up, Doc.